The instrument looked like a butter knife. In November 1941, inside an operating room at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C., a 23-year-old woman lay on a table with her skull open. She was conscious. She was talking. A surgeon named James Watts pushed a blade into the soft white tissue of her frontal lobes and swept it back and forth in what doctors called a lobotomy, while a neurologist named Walter Freeman sat beside her and asked her to sing. She sang "God Bless America." They measured how far to cut by listening to her voice. When the singing turned to mumbling, when the mumbling collapsed into silence, they stopped cutting. The woman on that table was Rosemary Kennedy, third child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, sister to a future president of the United States. She never spoke again. To understand how a 23-year-old woman ended up on Walter Freeman's operating table, you have to understand the family she was born into, and you have to understand what that family could not tolerate. Rosemary Kennedy was born on September 13, 1918, at the family home on Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts. Her birth went wrong from the start. The obstetrician was late. In 1918, there was a pandemic killing people by the millions, and doctors were stretched thin. A nurse at the house reportedly held the baby's head inside the birth canal for roughly 2 hours to delay delivery until the physician arrived. 2 hours. Most modern clinicians who've reviewed this case believe that's where the damage was done. Oxygen deprivation, what doctors now call hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Brain cells dying in real time while a nurse followed instructions and a doctor fought traffic. Rosemary was slow to crawl, slow to walk, slow to speak. She repeated grades. She struggled with reading. Arithmetic stuck at about a 4th grade level and never moved past it. But she was not helpless. That's the part most people get wrong. She kept a diary full of concerts and parties. She wrote letters to her father that said, "Darling Daddy, I am so fond of you and I love you so very much." She travelled across Europe. She attended a Montessori convent school in England where the nuns said she was thriving. And on May 11, 1938, Rosemary Kennedy curtsied before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. She was 19 years old, wearing a white gown, presented as a debutante alongside her mother and her sister Kathleen. She tripped slightly during the curtsy. The family treated it as a victory. That girl, in that white dress, on that night at Buckingham Palace, was 3 years away from having her brain destroyed. By 1940, something changed. Rosemary began having seizures, rages that frightened her caretakers. The nuns at her convent school in Washington, D.C. reported she was sneaking out at night. They feared the worst: pregnancy, disease, a scandal that could reach the newspapers. And for Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr., a scandal was the one thing his family could not survive. Joe Kennedy was not a man who tolerated problems. He was a former ambassador to the United Kingdom, a financier, a patriarch who was building, brick by brick, the most powerful political family in American history. His eldest son was being groomed for Congress. His second son, Jack, would become president within 20 years. The Kennedy image was a product. 9 children, athletic, brilliant, photogenic, unstoppable. Rosemary did not fit the product. So Joe Kennedy went looking for someone who could fix his daughter, and he found the most dangerous doctor in America. Walter Freeman was a Yale-trained neurologist who had never performed a surgery in his life. He had no surgical license, no surgical training. But he had read about a Portuguese physician named Egas Moniz, who was cutting into patients' brains to treat psychiatric illness, and Freeman had decided he could do it bigger. He brought the technique to America. He renamed it lobotomy. And on September 14, 1936, he guided his partner James Watts through the very first American prefrontal lobotomy on a 63-year-old housewife from Kansas named Alice Hood Hammett. Freeman kept photographers in the operating room. He published papers. He gave lectures. He toured the country performing lobotomies in hospitals, in clinics, eventually in his own office with nothing but a mallet and an ice pick through the eye socket. What he called the transorbital lobotomy, or ice pick lobotomy. Journalists called his car the Lobotomobile. By 1941, he had performed about 200 of these operations. He reported 63% improved, 14% got worse. Rosemary fell into that 14%. But here is what makes this story go from tragic to criminal. The surgeon himself, James Watts, the man who held the blade, told journalist Ronald Kessler decades later that he believed Rosemary didn't have an intellectual disability at all. Watts said she had a form of depression. The man who did the cutting thought they cut for the wrong reason. Joe Kennedy didn't bring his daughter to Freeman because she was sick. He brought her because she was inconvenient. And Freeman promised a fast solution. Joe Kennedy always wanted fast. After the surgery, Rosemary Kennedy was reduced to the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She was incontinent. Her left arm was paralyzed. She couldn't walk without someone holding her up. She couldn't form words. She was 23 years old. And then the Kennedys made her disappear. Joe told people his daughter had gone away to become a kindergarten teacher. A women's magazine printed a story suggesting she had a secret longing to go on the stage. Nobody questioned it. The Kennedys were not a family you questioned. The real Rosemary was in Jefferson, Wisconsin. A Catholic care facility called St. Coletta School for Exceptional Children. Joe built a private cottage on the grounds. 2 nuns, Sister Margaret Ann and Sister Leona, became her entire world. They fed her, bathed her, walked her through the gardens. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade. Joe Kennedy never visited. Not once. Rose Kennedy didn't see her daughter for roughly 20 years. And the lobotomy itself, the word lobotomy, didn't enter the public record until 1987. 46 years of silence, broken only when historian Doris Kearns Goodwin published The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys and pulled the entire story into daylight. Later, author Kate Clifford Larson's 2015 book, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, revealed even more devastating details. But this story has a turn, and the turn has a name. Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Rosemary's younger sister, the 5th Kennedy child, and the one who refused to let her sister be erased. In 1962, Eunice published an article in the Saturday Evening Post called Hope for Retarded Children. It was the first time any Kennedy publicly admitted that Rosemary had an intellectual disability. She didn't mention the lobotomy, not yet, but she cracked the wall. Then she started building. 1957, she took charge of the Kennedy Foundation and poured its money into disability research. 1961, she pressured her brother, President Kennedy, into creating the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. 1962, she opened her own farm in Maryland to children and adults with disabilities for a summer camp. She called it Camp Shriver. And on July 20th, 1968, at Soldier Field in Chicago, Eunice Kennedy Shriver opened the first International Special Olympics Games. 1,000 athletes, 26 states, Canada. Her brother had already made his mark too. On February 5th, 1963, JFK delivered the first presidential message to Congress about mental illness and intellectual disability. On October 31st, 1963, 22 days before Dallas, he signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. It was the last piece of legislation he ever signed. Between 1936 and the mid-1970s, roughly 40,000 to 50,000 Americans received lobotomies. About 60% of them were women. At some hospitals, that number passed 80%. Walter Freeman himself performed about 3,500 across 23 states. An estimated 490 of his patients died on his table. Among them were children like Howard Dully, who was lobotomized at age 12 in 1960, and later wrote a memoir about his experience. The lobotomy era finally ended when chlorpromazine, known as Thorazine, became available in 1952. For the first time, doctors had a drug that could treat psychiatric symptoms without destroying the brain. Freeman was banned from operating in 1967 after a woman named Helen Mortensen died of a brain hemorrhage during her third lobotomy at his hands. Ygaz Moniz still has his Nobel Prize. Every petition to revoke it has been denied. Nobel laureate Torsten Wiesel called the 1949 award a terrible mistake that caused permanent damage to thousands of patients. Rosemary Kennedy died on January 7, 2005. She was 86 years old. Eunice, Jean, Patricia and Ted were at her bedside. She spent 63 years in that cottage in Wisconsin because her father wanted a quiet daughter, and a doctor promised him one. The Special Olympics now serves more than 6 million athletes across 200 countries. In 2008, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development was named in her honor. Every single one of them competes, in part, because a 23-year-old girl was singing God Bless America on an operating table in November 1941. And then she wasn't. If stories like this stay with you, the next one is worse. Subscribe, because the history of medicine is darker than you think.